What is up, family and friends? Hey guys, welcome to the Family Bible Study. Here we are again doing another Family Bible Study. And so friends who are just jumping on for the first time, and family too, jumping on for the first time, excited about what we've got to cover today. Kind of a different scenario than what we've done, a little different format than what we've done in the past. And for you guys just joining us, welcome aboard. This is a slowed down Bible study, and particularly right now we are going through the book of James. And we have been in James 4 for a number of weeks. We do this, once a week, typically on Mondays here at 7 p.m. And the point of it is to pull and extract whatever the Lord has for us for today from the Scripture. And I say that because very often, I know in my life as well, sometimes reading the Bible just gets to be something that you do, a routine, or something you should do but you don't do, or you know how it is. And it's not feeding our spirit and helping us in our actual day-to-day life. And that should not be the case at all. So we slow down on this Bible study, and we extract a lot by the grace of God. He's always so faithful to give us really good stuff to learn and take away, and I take away stuff myself. So a couple of quick things up front too. I want to always mention that if you want more ministry, things like that, that I have compiled a YouTube channel called the Faith, Hope, Love Initiative, but the actual channel's name is the FHL Initiative. If you type it into YouTube, tons of great ministries on different life topics that are on there, especially if you go to the playlist section. And then I have some original content, so to speak, things that the Lord's put on my heart to teach and go over. And to that note, as I put in the description of this video, today I just put out the 7th chapter to an audiobook called How Satan Uses Emotions. And I'm telling you, I learn as I write, and there's a ton of really helpful stuff in there. And it really applies to all of us. If you're a person that's more emotionally consistent, you're not as prone to outbursts and ups and downs and quick highs and lows. It's still very, very applicable, because there's a lot of people, and I think I'm included in this, that your emotions tend to move more slowly, kind of below the scenes, and not so much sporadic as some of the more outgoing, faster paced personalities or whatever. But the point is, Satan runs roughshod over us, specifically through our emotions. But this particular chapter that's just put out is about spiritual maturing spiritually, that is, right? And it is, so if you're a person that's very interested in maturing and moving on, or you're a person that's maybe been saved for a little bit of time, but you're not really seeing the things that you want to see progress in your life, you're not quite sure, like, why am I not getting results? Where's the power of God in my life? I'm doing these things, going to church, praying, reading my Bible, but it doesn't seem like there's spiritual authority. You're not able to really see the things from the Bible in your life, so to speak. Then I would recommend jumping into that and checking it out. But we're going to talk about some of the things, I believe, today on this broadcast that are in that chapter, and it's not planned, actually. This chapter I've been working on for a couple of weeks, maybe more, and it's just now coming out. And then today we just happen to be landing on this particular section of James. So enough with that, but that's there, the link's on there. Let's dive into James chapter 4. And I'm going to do something a little different. It was normally I don't prepare for these. I just let the Lord kind of direct me from the inside out, so to speak, in terms of what we're going to talk about, what we're going to say as we go through these verses. It's just put the word in front of the eyes and then extrapolate, if you will. But I was sitting in church the other day, yesterday to be exact, in a church service, and out of nowhere, I start getting all this, what I call downloads, like all this information and revelation. The pastor wasn't even talking about this subject at all, but on this particular subject. And so I've written it down, and I'm going to kind of go through what the Lord gave me. So let's read the verse that we're on. So we're on James 4:13, as I alluded to at the end of the last broadcast. And that's where we're starting off. And this is a very interesting verse. And I'm just going to tell you in advance, there's a lot of maturity. I think spiritual maturity, in any verse of the Bible, it takes spiritual maturity to access the deeper levels of it and the higher levels of it. But this one was very challenging to me, and I'll tell you why. I have come from a background of business, being in business for myself, being in outside sales, and a bunch of other things. And in that world, it's a very fast-paced world, a very planning world. But that's kind of the world we live in general. I don't care if you're just, you're a business person, you're a school teacher, you're a doctor, you're a stay-at-home mom. It's just kind of this very fast-paced world, or head of a family or whatever the case may be. And usually what we tend to do is plan things like, this is how it's going to go, this is my plan, this is what I expect to happen, and so on. That is the natural, normal way of doing things. But as I've often reiterated on these Bible studies, God never, ever called us to be natural and worldly and do things like the world. His ways are very much the opposite of the world. And so when you're first kind of studying his ways, it's such a conundrum. It's almost like, there's no way that can work, because it's so different than what you've always been taught and the way you've operated, that it just kind of throws the natural mind for a loop. But as you start to test his ways and try his ways, what you'll find is they turn out better in the end. So let's read this verse, James 4:13. It says, "Come now, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go to such and such a city and spend a year there and engage in business and make a profit." That word, the phrase, "and spend a year there," that could also just mean spend a certain amount of time there. So let's go to this city and, we'll do some business, make some transactions happen, or, I'll go and we'll move here for a while, do some different things, or I'll get this job over here, build some income up, etc. It's a plan that you're putting together. So, excuse me on clear my throat. I don't know, suddenly I turn on the camera, I have to clear my throat. That's odd. But anyway, it goes on to say, so I'll repeat that. "Today or tomorrow we'll go to such and such a city and spend a year there and engage in business and make a profit. Yet," James says, "you do not know what your life will be like tomorrow. You are just a vapor that appears for a little while and then vanishes away. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and also do this or that." Or another way of saying that is, if it's the will of the Lord, if it's what the Lord wants, we will live and also do this and that, which is great. Not only will we will live, it's like, stop, you're going to live. Who knows if you'll even be here tomorrow? It's kind of what he's pointing out. So you're saying, if it's the Lord's will, not only will we still be here, but if it's what he wants, we're going to do this or that. So 16 says, "But as it is, you boast in your arrogance. All such boasting is evil." Wow, that was a quick turn, right? You were just making plans for what you're going to do next year, and suddenly he's saying you're arrogant, and that's evil. And so I'll explain some of this stuff, at least from the way I see it, from the perspective the Lord's given me here in just a little bit. And then finally, verse 17, which is the last verse of James 4. So 4:17 says, "Therefore, to one who knows the right thing to do and does not do it, to him it is sin." Okay? Now, some of you guys, of course, are probably right on par. You're like, I get it, that makes sense to me. And then others of you are probably more like I was the first time I read these verses. I was like, so what am I supposed to do then? I can't make plans, How am I supposed to operate? So let's dive into this. And that I was reading from the NASB version. Okay? So let's break this down. And again, I'm going to read. This is going to be a lot of reading and explaining what the Lord had impressed on my heart about this verse. Okay? So on the most basic level, let's just, as we break this verse down, this whole idea of planning and all this different stuff, on the most basic level, you don't know what I'm going to say 5 minutes from now. Do you? Right? Do you know or do you not know? And the answer, of course, is no, you don't know, and I don't even know, right? So, on the most basic level, we don't know what's going to happen 5 minutes from now, And so it's arrogant and foolish for us to make long-term plans with imagined certainty. We should approach the future in the light of the humble reality. Reality is honesty. That's another way of looking at reality, or another word for honesty is what's real, what's actually going on. So we should approach the future in the light of humble reality, that we are what I would call future blind, if that makes any sense to you. You know, a blind person can't see, and we can't see the future with certainty. And so we're future blind, naturally speaking. Right? Now, spiritually, we can get revelation from the Lord, and that's different. We'll talk about that, but naturally, we don't know what's going to happen 5 minutes from now. People are making plans what they're going to do in the next 5-10 years, right? Now, in fact, doesn't the business world tell you, you should have a 10-year plan? You should have a 5-year plan. If you're not, you're a loser. Well, that's because they didn't read James 4. You know, you might text them the Bible verse, because that's not the way God operates. And none of this is my opinion. You heard me read the verse. I'm just breaking it down. So on the other hand, God has all, I go on to say we're future blind, naturally speaking. Now on the other hand, God has all knowledge of the past, which means your individual past, but the past of the world, the present. He knows what's going on with you, your family. He knows what's going on around you. He knows what's going on in the nation, the world. He knows what's going to happen to you, and that, of course, would be the future. He has full knowledge of the future. Furthermore, he has a definite plan concerning what is to come. Never ever forget that. And I often refer to one of my favorite verses ever, Jeremiah 29:11, which of course says, for God speaking, I know the plans I have for you, the plans to prosper you, not to harm you. Plans. His plans don't always come to pass, by the way. I know that shocks some people, but it's dependent on us obeying, us getting in line with his plans. If it wasn't that way, we don't have free will. So God's either given us free will or he doesn't. And so he makes plans, and he's talking in that verse, Jeremiah 29:11, to Israel, who at that time was in exile. Why? Because they wouldn't follow him. They wouldn't obey him. He never planned on them going to exile. He never planned these bad things to come into their life. He never planned to let their enemies run roughshod over them, kill, their wives and children and husbands, and then move them to some random land. That was never his plan for Israel. And so now they've been through exile, or they're going into exile. And what he's saying to them is, I know the plans I have for you. They're good plans. So if you ever messed up, put yourself in a really bad spot, and you're like, I guess it's over for me now. No. It doesn't matter if you put yourself in, quote, exile, or put yourself in a bad financial situation, or a bad relationship, or a bad family situation, or whatever. That doesn't matter. He still has plans to get you out, but you have to come in line with those plans. And so that's what he says. I have plans to prosper you, not to harm you. I have plans to give you hope, which I always say is one thing. Hope is a thing by itself. Hope is like a picture of where you're going, where God's taking you. And he says, and a good future. That's the concept of Jeremiah 29:11, kind of just quickly broken down. Well, there's a lot more to every Bible verse, but there's a way to see that, okay, that particular verse. On the other hand, I said, okay, so God has a definite plan concerning what is to come. So when you woke up this morning, God had a plan for today. He had a plan for you, a way he wanted you to walk. And it's not about just trying to worry about did I get everything right? That's not the deal. He just has a good plan, and if we'll listen, he'll walk us through that plan, and he'll bring it to pass in our life. But most of us wake up and we have a plan for ourselves. So I don't want to get too far ahead of myself, but that's just the way it is. So it goes on. I went on to write, when we see ourselves as our own masters, we don't ask God for permission. We're kind of like teenagers. Now, can you imagine if you have a teenager at your house, like you are the parent or authority figure over a teenager, and they just come in and start telling you what they're going to do. Hey, I'm going to skip school for the next week, and me and some buddies are getting on a plane and going to Vegas. They're, I'm sorry, what? Yeah, we're going to be gone for a week, but I'll try to get some homework and stuff done. Oh, when I get back, though, there's this concert down in, several states away, and we're going to go to that too, and so on. And they just start dictating to you what they're going to do as their parent. Wow, right? So what does that have to do with anything? Well, that's not how a good household works. that only happens if a teenager does not submit or respect the authority of the parent. Now, that does happen in some households because the teenagers, their parents are very lax in discipline and so on and so forth. And so they kind of grow up in this mindset that I don't have to do what you tell me to do and all this. And if you've ever been a part of that household, it's chaotic. It doesn't work well, and it creates bad things in the life of that family and the teenager. Well, that's kind of the way it is with most of us with a God. It's like we tell him what we're going to do. Yeah, this is my plan. This is what I'm going to do, blah, 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 blah. There's no asking for permission. Well, why is that? We don't really see him as the master over us. We don't see him as the authority over us. We see ourselves as our own master, the master of our own fate, as a colloquial saying of the world goes. You're the master of your destiny. Good luck with that, since you don't know what's going to happen in 5 minutes. And I don't even believe in luck, so you're in bad shape, right? And so and again, I say that, laughing, but I didn't understand any of this stuff. I was like clueless, totally clueless, and I was certainly running my own life, that's for sure. And I was making my own plans, that's for sure. So if we look at this verse that we just went through, here in James, from a higher level of revelation. So the basic level is, listen, we don't even know what's going to happen in 5 minutes, so we should probably submit ourselves to God and rely on him because he's wiser and has better perspective. But let's look at it from a little higher level. Whenever we come up with a self-made plan, it will frequently conflict with the plan God has had from us, or has had for us since the beginning of our lives, really since the beginning of time. But I'm going to read you a verse here that specifically talks about from before you even were born. He already had a plan. And this is Psalms 139, 15 through 16. I keep this one up in front of me, keep it where I can see it in the house, and that's huge. So it says, my frame was not hidden from you. Now this is King David speaking, and he's prophetically doing a psalm. He says, my frame was not hidden from you, and I was made in secret, and skillfully formed in the depths of the earth. Your eyes have seen my formless substance. My formless substance. What does that mean? That means that little embryo there in the mother's womb hasn't even really started forming a body yet. It's just starting to come together. And already the Lord could see exactly who that was and who they would be and had a plan. It goes on to say, and in your book were written all the days that were ordained for me, when as there was not one of them. I'll say that again, because it applies to you too. So if you'd like to, let's do participation. Say your name out loud, okay? So TJ, and I goes, all the days were ordained for me, when as yet there was not one of them. So whatever situation you're dealing with today, whatever position you find yourself in, good or bad, doesn't make any difference. Before you were born, God knew you were going to be in that situation. He knew you were going to be in that circumstance. That's always given me, since I learned that, so much comfort in bad situations where you're like, I don't know in your mental capacities what I'm going to do. Good news, before you're born, God already knew that situation was coming, and he has a plan. So that's Psalms 139, 15 through 16 in the NASB 2020 that I just read. So let's keep moving here. I went on to write, if we are living based on self-made plans, we will frequently either have to die to our own plan, or you could say our own desires, or you could say to our own selfishness. So if that wasn't clear, what I'm saying is, I have a plan. Here's my plan, plan A. I want to go do this. And then I find out that's not what God wants. So now I have a conflict because I made a plan. I got my heart set on that. I got my mind set on that. I got my soulical part of me set on that. What's your soul? Your mind, your will, your emotions. They get all tied into these things. Oh, I want that new car so bad. I can taste it. We want to move into a new house out of this apartment so bad. You know what I mean? Oh, I just want that guy, or I want that girl, or I want to be married, or whatever. So bad. I want a boyfriend. I want a girlfriend, whatever it is. You get your soulical region. Maybe it's an event. Like I want to go on a vacation. This vacation I haven't planned. I want it so bad. But the thing was, from the top to the bottom, you planned everything, and now you're emotionally tied into it. Now, what happens if you find out that's not the will of God for your life? you're either going to have to, as I said, die to that plan because it's painful. It hurts your soul. It hurts your emotions and will. It's like, oh. And how do you know that's true? Because look at Jesus before he went to the cross. His mind, his body, the soul, the human part of him did not want to go to the cross. He's sweating blood. He's crying. He is going through it. But he goes on to say, not my will, what I want, but what you want, Lord. You know, what you want, Father, your will be done. That's called dying to yourself. And it's extremely painful, okay? It doesn't matter if you're Jesus. It's extremely painful. And it's okay. It's not, you haven't sinned if you have to die to your own desires and plans. Obviously, Jesus was sinless. It's just very painful. So I went on to write, if you will choose to follow your plans, if you choose to follow your plans, so you have two options. Either die to what you want or go, I can see that's probably not what should happen here. I probably shouldn't quit this job and go do this over here. I probably shouldn't do whatever, but I'm going to do it anyway. So you don't die to your plans. You go ahead and go through with your plans. I am going to buy that. I don't care if it's a good idea or a bad idea. I don't care if it puts me in debt or it doesn't put me in debt. I don't care if I can sustain it. I can't sustain it. I don't care if it hurts people's emotions and feelings. I don't care how it affects my wife. I don't care how it affects my kids. I don't care how it affects my husband. I don't care how it affects anybody. I'm going to do it. And I think we've probably all been there. I mean, I know I have, right? And so we go ahead and we do it anyway. Well, what's going to happen in that case is you forego whatever God was planning. Okay? So he's saying, I want to take you over here. He's like, hey, hang a strong right. It's kind of like, people say Jesus take the wheel. Jesus doesn't take the wheel. Okay? What Jesus does, he's like the best ever backseat driver. He says, hey, take a right. And you can choose. Do I want to go right or left? You're like, no, Jesus, I'm good. You're like, God, hey, I know this right. I got a shortcut. Let me hang the left. Take a left. Okay? But when you get yourself in a bad situation, and we've all been there, don't act like Jesus didn't tell you to take it right. That's the thing that, so often happens. Okay? And a quick car driving analogy, okay, I've often used. So let's go back to this writing here. I'm going to repeat. If you refuse to give up on your own plans, you're going to walk yourself into constant bad situations. Now, if we are foolish, we will blame God for the way our self-directed situations end up. And I can't tell you how many times in my life I've done that over and over, and thank God over time I've matured to the point where I'm like, when I get in a bad situation, I don't go, that was God, God, where were you? He has taught me, hey, that was poor decision making, but I got a plan, right? I got a plan to get you out. And so it's like, okay, praise God, I'm start listening, right? And I remember a minister who used to be at, one of those ministries where people would call in and request prayer. And this minister was on the phone when this older woman called in, maybe in her 70s or whatever, I don't know. She was older, unless you're 70, which is fairly young. I mean, maybe she was in her 90s, you know what I mean? But anyway. But she was a lady that was calling hysterical, and she was crying and, all this stuff because she had been robbed at gunpoint. And I got to truncate the short story for time's sake, but what the minister finally pulled out of her is he said, so to explain what happened, and she said, well, I prayed about it, and I kind of felt like I shouldn't probably go downtown, which is where she got robbed at gunpoint. But she's like, but, I just started quoting the 91st Psalm, which is a really popular psalm, but the Lord is your protector, and, God's going to protect you. So she starts quoting this psalm about how God will protect her. She goes downtown, she gets robbed at gunpoint, and now she's in this tizzy, like, where was God? I'm a child of God, I go to church, I'm a faithful member of church, why did this happen to me? This whole scenario, which again, I've been there lots of times in my spiritual immaturity, and it's very, very common for people to do that, And the minister, again, he pulled out of her that she ignored what we would call checking your spirit, which is there's just something inside of you going, you shouldn't do that. You shouldn't make that purchase. You shouldn't call that person. You shouldn't say that. You shouldn't be on the internet right now. You shouldn't be, get off of Facebook, get off of whatever, get off of YouTube. You need to step away from that. You don't want that job. All these different things. We get this check and we override the check, and then we put ourselves in situations. Now, God did his part. He tried to protect her. How did he protect her? By giving her a check in her spirit. Don't do that. And that's what happens so often. If you read the story of Israel in the Old Testament, God's constantly saying, don't do this, and then they do it. And don't do this, and then they do it. And they end up getting in bad situations over and over, which is exactly what we do in modern times if we refuse to listen. So Proverbs 14:12 to that note says, there is a way which seems right to a person, but in the end, key word there, in the end, because it looks golden up front, in the end, it is the way of death. Or other translations say, it leads to death. And how many times have we gotten something and we're like, I see it worked out. Woo, perfect. What a beautiful this. It worked out beautifully, I often use purchasing examples because I made lots of dumb purchases in my life. Like, oh, look, I got this great finance rate on this particular thing. It worked out perfectly. And then your bills start stacking up and you don't have money and you're stressed out and you're working extra hours and your family's feeling the pressure of that and all this different stuff, and it goes downhill. Or, hey, this is such a great guy. People are like, that's not the right person for you. And you're like, no, listen. And you got your list of credentials why you want to date this guy or date this girl. And you just stack them up. No, listen. I just know this is the Lord. The Lord's doing this for me. And it turns out to be the ruin of your life for a period of time. You know what I mean? Or you end up in bad situations or whatever. And this is like a common human experience. But the reason I'm talking about this, I believe, is because it doesn't have to be. We don't have to just accept this is the way it is for everybody. Not if you're a believer. There should be a difference between the people that believe in God, who have access to his ways, and people who don't. So there should be a difference, and we have to start learning how to walk in that difference, or we end up in the same bad situations as people who have no access to God. So this is a little longer than I thought it would be. So moving on, I wrote, this verse displays the verse I just read about, there is a way which seems right to a person, but in the end leads to death. This verse displays why it's a benefit to us to earnestly seek God and wait for God's directions and plans. Wait for God's directions. Wait for. Very tough on our soul, on our emotions to wait. We don't normally like waiting, naturally speaking, but it's beneficial. See, we may have a tentative expectation of the future. So you probably have an expectation of what's going to happen tomorrow. Maybe you plan on going to work, or you have a business routine, or a family routine, a household routine, or whatever. You kind of have an expectation, or you have some tentative plans or whatever set up, or whatever, sure plans set up. So you kind of have an expectation of what you're going to do. But we should hold to those expectations of the future lightly if God did not specifically tell us what to expect. Now, of course, in order to understand what God's specifically telling us, we have to start learning how to discern his voice and how to discern that check or that direction or whatever the case may be. And that's something we have to grow up into. But what the point of the matter is, if God has specifically laid something on your heart and your being, and he says, this is going to happen, like from a Bible example, Abraham, you're going to be the father of many nations. You're going to have lots and lots of descendants. Now, Abraham can plan on that. He can expect that. Why? Because it came from God. He didn't say, I'm going to have a bunch of descendants. It wasn't his idea. It was God's idea. Now it can be planned on. It can be counted on. Okay? So moving on, it also benefits us not to assume how God is going to work something out for us. What does that mean? Let's say God lays something on your heart. I'm going to do this for you. I'm going to provide in this area for you. Okay? We don't want to start assuming how he's going to do that. Start making conjectures about, I think this is the way he's going to work it out. I got a bill to pay on the money. I think maybe he's going to get my neighbor to give me that money. I think my boss is going to give me a bonus. And you just start making things up. And then it's like, yeah, I think that's the way it's going to work out. It's very, very dangerous ground to be on, friend, for sure. And I'm talking from experience. I was super bad at that, and it just led to a lot of disappointment. I went on to write, when we get fixated on our own ideas, it makes it hard for us to adjust to God's plans because we're fixated on how we think it's going to be done. Furthermore, fixation on our own ideas causes us to make blunders, such as Abraham and Sarah did when they orchestrated the birth of Ishmael through their slave girl. So read Genesis 16 if you're not familiar with that story. But again, God told Abraham approximately 25 years before he had his child that he was going to bring him a child. 25 years before, God said, I'm going to give you a child and descendants. Well, that's 25 years of waiting, so to speak, of expectation. And so if you read that account, Sarah comes up with her own idea and says, well, maybe God will do it this way. And if we ever start doing that, that's a huge red flag. You're making up something, right? Well, maybe he'll do it this way, and we start pursuing that path. And she said, well, listen, we have this slave named Hagar, so why don't you marry my slave Hagar, go and sleep with her, and have a child through her, and now we'll have a child as a family. Sounds good. Maybe that's what God meant. It's not what God said. So they did that, and it ended up to be a huge problem in their family. And to this day, it's an ongoing problem between the Jewish people and the descendants of Hagar, which is the Arab nations and so on. I mean, flip on the news, and you'll see the countries around Israel persecuting Israel, and those are the descendants of Ishmael that are warring against to this day the descendants of Isaac, which was the child that God had promised Abraham, and at 100 years old, he gave Abraham. He fulfilled on his promise at his own time in his own way. Again, the flesh doesn't like to hear that. The soul doesn't like to hear that because they're like, oh, that's a lot of waiting. I can give you a tip. It's a lot of waiting. It's probably very tough on Abraham, but Abraham lived like 4,000 years ago, and we still know his name. I think that's worth waiting 25 years. I mean, the man was ridiculously, honored by God, and so, yeah, I think he got some value out of that waiting, and that's the way it always works. If we're willing to wait, God's willing to make it better than we could have, right? Moving on. Went on to write, if we're going to live out God's plans, we must go through the extensive process of progressively learning to follow God's ways. Notice the word progressively learning. It's a process for all of us. And it's an ongoing process, really, in a lot of ways. We can always get better and more succinct in terms of understanding it. So it's a learning process throughout life. But this requires more than just memorization if we're going to follow God's His will. It requires more than just memorization of Bible stories, Bible verses, and Bible passages. The Bible, apart from the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, only gives us broad strokes concerning the ways and the will of God. I realize that was a mouthful. Let me explain what I mean by that. Is if we're just going to go, okay, I'll read my Bible and see what's in here, and we just, what's my favorite story? We read our favorite story, or we read these verses like the 91st Psalm, and we just like, okay, yeah, I memorized this, and now I'm following the ways of God. We're going to run into a lot of problems from experience. Now, that's a good place to start and start building from, but as we've all experienced, because I think if you've been in the Bible much or around Christendom much or whatever, church world much, most of us have done that. We just pull arbitrary scriptures out and try to apply them to our life. But if we look back on how that's really worked out for us, it's like, yeah, that didn't really work out. That I didn't get the results I wanted, or I was expecting, or anything like that. And so what I'm doing is I'm just explaining what the Lord explained to me. This is why you don't get results. Maybe you're a mom with a sick kid, and you're like, well, Jesus is a healer, but my kid's still sick. Why is that? Or maybe you don't have finances, and you're like, well, God's a provider, but I don't have finances. And so, if we just read the Bible in general, but we're not like, hey, as I often say, God, let's talk. Please, you open the Bible and say, let's have a conversation. I need to hear from you. I need you to reveal things to me, so on. If He's not actively doing that with you, then you just walk away with a bunch of head knowledge, but not much to work with. And so I'll give you a few examples in terms of what that looks like. I said the Bible is broad strokes. So what you might read is that maybe you have a money problem going on, and you read that Jesus sent Peter to pay their taxes by catching a fish, and in that fish's mouth was a gold coin, or was a coin. And Peter took the coin out of his mouth, of the fish, I'm saying, and then he went and paid the taxes for Jesus and himself. And you say, wow, yeah, I know that story, or that's a great story. Even though you know the story, maybe you're still broke. Maybe you're still in debt. And I'm talking about, I was a poster child for that. So I knew that story. So I go, well, God's a provider, but it wasn't producing anything for me. So here's another example. Broad strokes. The Bible gave us a broad stroke, which is God's a provider. It's a broad stroke. Look at the story. He's a provider. Number 2, God miraculously rescued the Israelites from Egyptian slavery. Second example. But even though God miraculously rescued these million-plus people from a situation that was impossible to ever get out of, period, we can still be enslaved to addictions or mindsets that aren't right, or we can be enslaved in bad situations that we don't want to be in, but we're stuck. But we can know that God's a deliverer, right? It's just a broad stroke because we might know the story, but we don't know how to get that in our lives. Number 3 example, David killed Goliath. We all know the story that David killed Goliath. But even if we know that story, if we're not taking the time to say, God, let's talk, help me to understand how this applies in my life, we can know that David killed Goliath, an intimidating giant, but we can still live in fear of intimidating situations ourselves and live in fear of certain people, intimidating people in our own lives. We can still be shackled by fear, but know that story. So I'm just trying to help you understand that it's not enough. Like you want to start by reading your Bible and reading it consistently and just getting in there as an act of faith and start to get some of this stuff under your belt, the knowledge of it. But then if you want to see results in your life consistently, then you have to, at least been my experience, we have to start progressing into getting revelation and seeking God out for revelation and not just Bible stories and verses we can quote or whatever the case is. So again, it's an explanation. If you don't feel like you've gotten the results of faith that you see in the Bible, these are some places to look into. So let's keep moving on. However, those are a few examples I wrote, obviously. We must learn to recognize the communication of the Holy Spirit in order to actually live out God's specific plans for us each day. Now, I don't have a lot of time for that. I would recommend you to the Faith, Hope, Love channel, the FHL Initiative channel. The link's in the description. There's stuff on that. If you feel free to message me, and I can send you the stuff from different ministers. I think I have some stuff on there about that as well. But I don't have time to dive into that. But the bottom line is we have to start learning to recognize the communication of the Holy Spirit in order to actually live out God's plans, specific plans for us day by day. God is always trying to speak to us, but in our natural mind, we're often not in tune to his frequency. So you may have heard this example and may have not. It's a good example. Right now, wherever you're at, there's radio signals going on in your room, in your place, right? True or false? There's radio signals going. And if you turn the radio on, you aren't going to pick up all its channels. You're only going to pick up the channel you tune your radio to, right? And then you'll start hearing what was always there. The radio, they're always broadcasting, right? And that's the way God is. He's always got something to say, and he's trying to say, don't go downtown, you're going to get robbed. Don't buy that car. Let that girl go. Let that guy go. Don't take that, opportunity. Don't, this isn't the right opportunity for you. He's always trying to say these things, and we are so unattuned to his frequency, goes right over our head, and we're just making these decisions, and we're dealing with the consequences of bad decisions. That's what's happening. So our endeavor, what we endeavor to do, is to start to get around him and just in the Word of God and prayer, these different things, and tune our spirit so when he's speaking something, we go, whoa, that's not me. I wouldn't have thought. That's God. And we make decisions based on what we're getting from him. That is such a process. It takes time, but anybody that is a born-again believer has the right to tune into his frequency, so to speak. So I went on to write, learning to recognize and heed the voice of the Spirit, the Holy Spirit, is a process that often involves disappointing missteps and failure. That's been my experience. In other words, it's like, I thought that was the Lord, and I made that decision. It was not the Lord. That was me, And saying, okay, so that's not, it's not him. And because other than that, what you're saying is he's been broadcasting at this frequency since eternity. And you're saying, no, God, you need to come to my frequency. You need to adjust your frequency, and you need to speak my language. Who in the world are you? We just got here, you know what I mean, on the planet. I don't care if you're 150 years old. Compared to God, you just got here. You know, he doesn't need to adjust to our frequency. We need to adjust to his frequency because he's God. You know, never forget that. And so, but as we do that and come up to his frequency, we get such benefit from that. Anyway, so I went on to write, yet gaining the recognition of his voice, it's a lot of missteps and failure involved, but gaining the recognition of his voice is valuable and worth the effort. Okay. We'll go on to say about that topic, if we want to recognize God's voice, we must learn to pursue him passionately. We pursue him through reading, listening, and talking to God about his word. Just talking to him. You know, I was thinking about that verse I read the other day, Lord, that makes no sense to me. Can you please help me understand that better? And then it's on him. He has a responsibility to communicate back and get that to you. And it may not be, usually it's never like a booming voice from heaven. A lot of times it's just like the next week at your church, your pastor says something, and you're like, that's exactly the question I asked. Or maybe you're on a live broadcast on Facebook and a question gets answered, you're like, I've been wondering about that. That's God operating. He typically operates through people and through different ways, but sometimes it'll just come up inside of you and you're like, oh, that's the answer. It's almost like a thought. You're like, but it's the thought that's an answer to the question you had, and you wouldn't have known the answer, which is why you're asking it, but suddenly there's a thought thing. You're like, oh, that makes so much sense. So there's a lot of ways he can get information through to you if you're willing to take the time and say, hey, I want to understand this, right? So went on to write here, we also pursue fellowship with God through prayer, obviously, worship, just worshiping God, you know, taking the time from your heart to worship him. Taking communion, you can, I don't know if you know this, you don't have to do that in church. You can do that at your house with, you know, bread and grape juice or whatever it is that you use for communion. Taking communion is a way of communing, you know, obviously, fellowshipping with God, just talking with him, you know, throughout your day, and doing other activities that focus your being on him. That's the point. You're focused on God. Let me ask you this. Have you ever built a great relationship with someone that you didn't take a lot of time with, that you didn't focus your attention on? Have you ever? A great relationship? You know, how in the world are we going to build a great relationship with God if we're kind of always, he's like in passing and cursory in our life, you know? It's like, oh yeah, God, yeah, also, you know, oh, great. Big man upstairs. It's just going to be very, very tough to operate and live in faith if that's our attitude, very flippant. All right, we're going to start wrapping up here. So I give a brief illustration. As an illustration of how our relationship with God and faith works, okay, I'm going to give this, and I think this is going to be it for today. As an illustration of how our relationship with God and how faith works, not how it doesn't work, how it actually does work. Suppose you have a wealthy and loving father. You have a wealthy and loving dad who has placed everything you need for your whole life in a passcode protected vault. I know. I'm sure some of you guys are like, that'd be awesome, right? However, in this analogy, access to that safe requires, as I said, a passcode, but that passcode constantly changes every single day without your knowledge. Now, if you don't know the passcode, even though there's all that stuff in a vault, your situation in life would be the exact same as someone who didn't have a vault full of stuff. Does that make sense? But suppose your good and gracious Father always has the current passcode. If you wanted to access what you needed or wanted from the things he supplied specifically for you, I mean, it's in there for you, not for someone else. It's in there for you. If you wanted to access it, you would have to continually check back with him in order to get what you need. So, hopefully you can draw the analogy, but that's the life of a believer. God's already prepared every problem you've had, every challenge emotionally, spiritually, mentally, financially. Pick an issue. He's already got the answer to that issue set aside. Okay? But if you don't access those things, or you don't know how to access those things, which is very often the case for us as believers, you're just like a person who doesn't know God. You're not getting access to what he's provided, so you have to live just like, John Doe down the road that doesn't even pay any attention to God whatsoever. And that's why so many times believers' lives are just like the people of the world, is because we don't know how to access these things. So in reality, God has provided everything we need for life and for godliness. The word specifically says, 2 Peter 1 through 3, his divine power has granted to us everything. His divine power, that's spiritual power, has granted. You're granted. Yes, granted. Yes, you can. It's yours. That's granted to us. Everything pertaining to life. Think about what you need right now. Does it pertain to life? Yes, and godliness. So do you want to be godly? Do you want to live your life towards God in a pleasing way? He's provided for you to do that. Now watch this. He's granted to us everything pertaining to life and godliness through, very key word, the knowledge. Other words for knowledge, perception, discernment, recognition of him who called us by his own glory and excellence. Through the knowledge of him who called us through his own glory and excellence. What's the emphasis? So that's 2 Peter 1:3, like I said. The emphasis is, if you don't have the knowledge of what he's provided, and you don't have the knowledge of how to access that, then you don't get to participate in what he has granted for you. He said, yes, you can have it. I set it aside for you. But you don't have access to it. And let me make sure I'm done with that little analogy there. Yeah, so I'm going to be done with it from there. But the thing I want you to walk away with from that little analogy, and we'll probably hit on this next week, is we're not supposed to be Christian gold diggers. I've said that before. What does that mean? You guys all know that some people want to marry another person just because of what they've got, or they want to be a boyfriend or a girlfriend. They want to be in a relationship of some sort, even a friendship or whatever, business association, just because someone else has a bunch of stuff, because they have what could benefit them. I'm not suggesting chase God down because he has a vault with stuff in it for you. That's called being a gold digger. And we all kind of start there. I think that's why most of us give our lives to God. It's like, I'm not giving my life to God because I was like, I believe in heaven and I believe in hell. And I'm not going to hell because that sounds terrible. And it is terrible. It's a legitimate, actual place. And I was like, I'm not doing that. So God, I'm going to give my life to you. And I guess that means I'm on your program, whatever that program is, but I ain't going to hell. That's kind of being gold diggerish. In other words, it's like saying, I don't want to be homeless and you're a landlord, so it sounds like you're hiring, and if I work for you, you'll give me a place. You know what? Doesn't sound so bad. Let's work for this guy because I don't want to be homeless, right? That's just working for someone because of what they can do for you, and that's kind of how I came to God too, and that's what a lot of people do. So you can start there. It's fine. But we should mature past that point and get to the point that we realize he's a good father. He is goodness incarnate. He's everything good. And we just want to pursue him for him. But since we have this relationship with him, he's also provided everything we need, and we can learn to get access to that. Okay? So that's going to be it for tonight. I think that's a lot. That may have just been a fire hydrant worth of information and things. I mean, that took some of that stuff. He's taken years to unpackage for me, and I've learned through great ministers and things like that, and learned a lot of that stuff that I'm passing on in this 50 minutes or whatever, however long this has been. So I suggest, if you find some value in that, if there's something that the Lord's doing with you, kind of giving you some revelation about that, listen to it again, man. That's what I do. I go back over stuff over and over and over to gain out of it what's there. You're never going to gain all the revelation, but you don't need all the revelation. You just need what you need right now for where you're at today. Because guess what? You only live in today, period. You never live in yesterday. You never live in tomorrow, not physically speaking. So just like we only eat normally for today, we don't try to eat for a week in advance, you got to just eat what you need that day. And so go back over some of this stuff, and like I said, get in the Word for yourself, and you don't have to be some kind of scholar about it, just with a genuine heart, start looking for answers, and God has a part too, and you can't do that part. His job is to give us revelation, and our job is to put ourselves in front of Him with sincere hearts and put the Word in front of our mind. And so there's that, guys. Hopefully that I'm going to trust God that has helped some of you guys. And we will presumably pick up next week, Monday at 7 p.m. like we usually do. So love you guys, and make it a great rest of your evening or whenever you watch this video. All right.